This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Foundations, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and in this video I'm continuing with my limited set review for Foundations. So far I've looked at all the non-green cards in the set, and in this video we'll be looking at the green ones. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. Keep in mind that we're only talking about draft and sealed here. I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters, and that means cards with the set numbers between 1 and 271. There are incredibly rare special guests that can appear in play boosters, but I'll talk about them in the next video. These are of course my evaluations of these cards before it's been possible to play Foundations Limited, because the goal here is to have this ready for you by the pre-release, and that means these are projections, and I'm going to be wrong about some stuff, but as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have panned out. This set is also about half reprints, so I actually do have experience playing with a lot of the cards in this set. Before we get started, I want to let you know that there's some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description, where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the green cards in Foundations. First up, it's Ambush Wolf, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/2 wolf at common with flash, and when it enters, you exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. This seems solid enough. You can flash it in and trade up with it sometimes, and you get a decent rate out of the card in general. Sometimes you might even take Threshold away at instant speed, but don't get too excited about that. It's not going to happen that often. It does also have 4 power, which matters for the red-green deck, so any card that costs like 2 or 3 and has 4 power gets a little bit of a bump. Overall, I think this is a C. Next up, it's Apothecary Stomper, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 elephant at common with vigilance, and when it enters, you choose one, put 2 +1/+1 counters in target creature you control, or you gain 4 life. This can put counters on itself, so if it's alone, it can be a 6 mana 6/6 Vigilance, which is a pretty decent creature to have at the top of your curve, especially when it's going to be relevant during your turn and your opponent's, thanks to Vigilance. Gaining 4 life with it is what you'll only do when you desperately need to stabilize, and when that's good, it can be really good. You can, of course, also put those 2 counters on something else, which is probably what you're going to do the most often, provided you have a built-out board, because it can drastically improve an attack you already have on the board, instead of having to wait a turn for the Apothecary Stomper to attack. It does cost 6, so it's probably just a C, but I am kind of close to giving it a C+. Next up, it's Beastkin Rager, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 Elf Ranger at common with trample, and whenever another creature you control enters, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. A 3 mana 3/3 Trampler is probably a C at the very best. Trample's nice at all, but you need your creature to be pretty big for trample to be really relevant, and this will be like a 4/3 Trampler on your turn pretty often and sometimes bigger, but it's just going to be a 3/3 a lot of the time too. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Cackling Prowler, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 Hyena Rogue at common with Ward 2, and it has Morbid, which means something good happens if a creature died this turn. In this case, at the beginning of your end step, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Prowler. A 4 mana 4/3 with Ward 2 is kind of passable. The ward helps make the relatively low toughness hurt less, since your opponent has to pay more to kill it outside of combat, and it will get to 5/4 reasonably often. Sometimes the turn it comes down, but I think this is our 4th consecutive C. Next up, it's Eager Truffle Snout, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/2 boar at uncommon with trample, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you create a food token. So if you get this down on 3, there's a pretty good chance it's going to give you that food when you attack with it, even if your opponent trades their 2-drop or whatever, and that exchange feels pretty good. And should it be able to do combat damage more than once, you're going to get a ton of value. It also happens to have 4 power, which certainly matters in this format. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Elfsworn Giant, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 5/3 giant at common with reach, and it has Landfall, create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. The stat line isn't great, but this Landfall trigger is legit. Even if you just get 1/1/1 out of it, you're pretty happy. I mean, a 5 mana 5/3 reach that makes a 1/1 when it enters is probably a B-, and while this is worse than that in some ways, namely you have to play a land before you get there, it's also better in other ways because it can make multiple tokens. As is often the case with landfall cards, the ideal thing is to wait until you can play this the same turn you can also play a land, and in that case it feels pretty close to a 5 mana 5/3 reach that makes that 1/1. Still, there are going to be times where you have to run it out and you don't have time to play a land and you have to trade it off for something, and that's not going to feel very good. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Elvish Regrower, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/3 elf druid at uncommon, and when it enters, you return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. This looks great, like all the Eternal Witness-like cards are. It's just going to be a 2-for-1 almost every time you cast it, and the body is actually pretty significant here, capable of trading for a whole lot or even just smashing in for 4. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Felling Blow, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls. 3 mana for a counter and a bite effect is pretty good. The stats boost is permanent and often gives you a good attack the same turn you remove their creature. I don't love that this is a sorcery, as this kind of removal needs a very particular window for you to safely cast it. Like, if your opponent has mana up, you can get blown out any number of ways. It's also just a little bit too expensive, so I think it falls short of being a premium removal spell, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Loot Exuberant Explorer, who for 2 generic and a green is a 1/4 legendary beast noble at rare. It lets you play an additional land on each of your turns, and you can pay 4 generic and 2 green, and look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control from among them, and put it on the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. The play additional land line of text is very underwhelming and limited, as you often aren't able to take advantage of it. Even when you play this on turn 3, you're pretty far from guaranteed to have extra lands in your hand. When you can take advantage of it, it's nice, but don't put too much weight into it. Don't look at this as a way to consistently ramp your mana. It won't work out if that's what you're looking for. But the activated ability is where there's some serious value here, and it's a great one for the late game. It basically makes it impossible for you to flood out, since you will virtually always get to put a creature on the board with it, and you can do it at instant speed, so passing the turn with mana up makes your opponent's life pretty miserable. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Mossborn Hydra, which for 2 generic and a green is a 0/0 elemental Hydra at rare. It has trample, it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it, and it has landfall, double the number of +1/+1 counters on this creature. This starts off super inefficient, and you really need 2 landfall triggers to feel like you're getting there, and that is asking for something significant, since you have a vulnerable, weak creature that can die to virtually everything. The ideal thing is to drop it on a turn where you can play your land drop after so that it can grow to a 2/2 right away, but that's not exactly a scary creature. If it's an evolving wild, you can get it all the way up to 4/4, at which point we're talking about something. It does ultimately snowball and get completely out of control in the late game if no one kills it, but the starting point is pretty bad. I think that holds it to a B-. Next up, it's Needletooth Pack, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 4/5 dinosaur at uncommon. It has Morbid. At the beginning of your instep, put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. Morbid can be hard to trigger consistently, but man, Needletooth Pack gives you quite the payoff. There are going to be times where you play it and it's effectively a 5 mana 4/5 that puts 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, and that's great. And it can keep doing it, provided you can keep triggering Morbid. And the great thing here is you really only need to trigger Morbid a single time with this to be way ahead, and if you do it more than once, things will get out of control. I can really get behind this Morbid card. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Preposterous Proportions, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a rare sorcery. Creatures you control get +10/+10 and gain vigilance until end of turn. This can turn almost any board lethal, and it's going to be pretty rare that your opponent isn't forced to block and lose some creatures just to survive. So this isn't the kind of buff that doesn't impact the board on later turns. While Trample would probably be better, granting Vigilance isn't bad, since it means you can use this and attack on virtually any board state without giving up anything on defense. That means if you only have like 2 creatures, you can actually cast this, attack your opponent, they're at least going to have to block one of them. And while that's not like awesome, that's kind of what the fail case on this card is. And Vigilance helps make the floor on this a lot higher than it would otherwise be. It's expensive, but also frequently just a game ender, and it's rarely irrelevant. I like this a lot. I even think this is a bomb, because there simply aren't many situations where this doesn't either effectively or literally let you win the game. You'd have to have no creatures at all, or I guess maybe 1 for it to be irrelevant, and that just doesn't happen in Limited. I'm giving this an A-. Next up, it's Quake Strider Ceratops, which for 3 generic and 3 green is a 12/8. Talk about a big ol' vanilla creature. Obviously, the stat line is fairly efficient, although the triple green can be brutal sometimes and limited, but this seems like a pretty reasonable creature to have at the top of your curve. It's big enough that most really cheap removal can't take it down, and that's important. All that said, it's still just like a C. I know it's tempting to get excited about this efficiency, but that's all it has going on, which makes it hard for it to be anything special. It can be chumped block forever and still killed by a lot of cheap removal in the format. Next up, it's Quilled Great Worm, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 7/7 worm at Mythic Rare. It has Trample. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage during your turn, put that mini +1/+1 counters on it. You may cast this card from your graveyard by removing 6 counters from among creatures you control, in addition to paying its other costs. This is insane. A 6 mana 7/7 Trampler is normally the kind of card you feel okay about having at the top of your curve, and this has way more going on than that. Note that your creatures get +1/+1 counters when they do combat damage, and not just damage to players, so it makes combat incredibly lopsided in your favor once you have this in play. And it won't be hard to quickly get counters on your creatures and let you get the Great Worm back later in the game. There might be an occasional situation where you just don't have a board that can attack at all, but the fail case is still that you get a 6 mana 7/7 Trampler that threatens to grow to a 14/14 on the next turn when it attacks. So yeah, I mean, this is obviously a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Spinner of Souls, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/3 Spider Spirit at rare. It has Reach. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This has nice base stats, and that turn it comes down, you can often just attack however you want, since if your opponent tries to trade or something, they just get 2 for 1 because of the Weaver's ability. It's a little sad that it doesn't count itself with its Death Trigger ability. That's what it would need to be a straight up bomb, but it will usually give you a pretty big advantage, while also having this nice stat line, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Sylvan Scavenging, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, choose one, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, or create a 3/3 green raccoon creature token if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. This looks pretty good, although I do want to note that getting the counter at your end step is a lot worse than getting it at the beginning of combat, which we've seen a lot lately. But you do at least get a counter the turn you play it, and that in itself is a decent deal, getting a counter every turn. But getting the 3/3 raccoon is where this really becomes powerful. And obviously, getting those counters can help you set that up if you don't already have a creature in play with power 4 or greater. This is the definition of a value engine, one that it's pretty easy to generate game-winning value with, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Treetop Snare Spinner, which for 3 generic and a green is a 1/4 spider at common with Reach and Death Touch, and you can pay 2 generic and a green to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, activate only as a sorcery. This is a pretty frustrating creature to play against since you can't really attack into it until you have something with 4 or more power, and that might not even be enough since you can sink mana into it to put counters on it or your other creatures. The sorcery restriction makes that ability a lot weaker, but it's still pretty solid. When you're flooding out, you'll be very happy to have that ability, giving this a C. Alright, now we're moving into the green reprints, starting with Affectionate Indrik, which for 5 generic and a green is a 4/4 beast at uncommon. When it enters, you may have it fight target creature you don't control. So this typically comes down and kills like a 3/3, and that feels pretty good. There are sometimes board states where what you need to kill is a lot bigger, in which case the Indrik might just be able to be like a 6 mana kill spell, which is pretty mediocre, or it may not be able to kill the thing at all. So I think you're overpaying for this a little bit. Like where we've seen this kind of card be really good in the past is on a 5 mana 4/4 with this enters trigger. And while this was pretty good last time we saw it, it's been long enough that I think it slipped a little bit. Still, it's a pretty good card. It's just not one I think I'm ever going to be happy about first picking. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bite Down, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. Being an instant is good. That's one thing this has on it that the other Bite card that we saw earlier doesn't. While that one costs 1 more mana and gives you a counter, I think being an instant and 1 mana cheaper matters a lot more and makes this better. Because you do have to have those specific windows where you can use a card like this, and being an instant means you can find those a lot more easily. Green decks are usually able to turn this into a really efficient removal spell. It's extra good with Death Touch creatures and stuff. I think this one does sneak into the lower premium range, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Blanchwood Armor, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each forest you control. This is awful, unless you're mono green, which just doesn't really happen in Limited, and even when you do play mono green, this still opens you up to a 2-for-1 from a whole lot of different removal spells. It's an F. Next up, it's Broken Wings, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. Destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. Most opponents will only have like 3 or 4 targets for this, but that's just not enough for you to main deck it. It's a D+ if you play it in your main deck, and a C+ out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Bushwhack, which for 1 green is a common sorcery. Choose one, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle, or target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. This was underwhelming the last time we saw it. I mean, it's certainly not bad. After all, it's flexible. It can help you hit land drops and fix your mana when that's what you need, and if you have a creature in play who's good at fighting, it turns into a reasonably efficient, albeit risky, removal spell. But it's not particularly good at either thing it does. Those cards individually are both like C- at best. Having an option between them is better, but I don't think this is any better than a C. Next up, it's Doubling Season, which for 4 generic and a green is a mythic rare enchantment. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. If an effect would put 1 or more counters on a permanent you control, it puts twice that many of those counters on that permanent instead. This is one of those cards that just isn't here for us Limited players. You just can't afford to spend 5 on something like this that has no impact on the board initially and requires you to really build around it to actually do anything. And even when you do, there's no guarantee you'll actually be able to generate tokens or get counters within the first couple of turns it's in play. It's just an F. Next up, it's Dwinin Giltleaf Dane, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 3/4 legendary elf warrior at uncommon. It's got reach. Other elves you control get +1/+1, and when it attacks, you gain 1 life for each attacking elf you control. On its own, this is a 4 mana 3/4 with reach that gains you 1 life when it attacks. That's certainly not great. It's like a C- probably. But this format does have other elves. Again, as we've seen throughout the week, typal payoffs aren't a huge part of this format, but every color has a few creature types that it has a few payoffs for, and there are enough elves in the set for this to buff some of your creatures. You're not really going to have an elf deck per se, but you'll have a deck with elves in it, and because this has a reasonable baseline, I think it ends up being like a C+. Next up, it's Dwinin's Elite, another one of those elves, and another elf payoff. For 1 generic and a green, it's a 2/2 elf warrior at common, and when it enters, if you control another elf, you create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. Like I just said, there are enough elves at lower rarities in green for this to make a 1/1 a decent chunk of the time, although not usually on turn 2, since there's only one 1-mana elf in the set. If this was always a 2-mana 2/2 that gave you a 1/1, it'd be an easy B, maybe a B+. That's just an amazing rate. But it's just going to be a 2/2 a big chunk of the time, and that's not really a card you can play in Limited anymore, a vanilla 2-mana 2/2. So I think the total package here is a C+. Next up, it's Elvish Archdruid, another elf with an elf payoff. This one's 1 generic and 2 green for a 2/2 elf druid at rare. Gives your other elves +1/+1, and you can tap it for green for each elf you control. So, on its own, this is a 3-mana 2/2 that can tap for green, which isn't terrible. And this format does, of course, have those other elves. So, again, you're likely to have some elves around to make it better, but it's going to be pretty hard to ever, break it, because there just aren't enough elves or elf payoffs for you to get there consistently. I think this is another C+. It has this reasonable baseline. It's going to be a little bit better than being on its own, because you'll have some elves, but you're never going to have an elf deck. Next, let's look at Garruk's Uprising, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature you control with power 4 or greater enters, draw a card. This and other cards like it have never really performed well in Limited. I mean, it is nice that it draws you a card whether you already have a 4-power creature, and then can also do it later when you have other 4-power things come into play. And trample can be good with those big creatures, but it doesn't add to the board, and even decks built around 4-power stuff are going to find themselves drawing with this a lot less than they'd expect. You'd much rather play like a 3-mana 4/2 most of the time in your power 4 or greater deck than you would this. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Genesis Wave, which for X and 3 green is a rare sorcery. Reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put any number of permanent cards with mana value X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Then put all cards revealed this way that weren't put onto the battlefield into your graveyard. This is great when you have a ton of mana. Problem is, you just won't have that going on enough in Limited, and you need to be sinking like 7 total mana into this before it does something consistently, and even then, there's a real risk you don't get your mana's worth back. I think it's just a D. Next up, it's Galta Primal Hunger, which for 10 generic and 2 green is a 12/12 legendary Elder Dinosaur at rare. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control, and it has trample. This wasn't great last time we saw it. It is a must-kill threat, but getting it into play isn't that easy. Red-green decks do look reasonably well equipped to run out Galta on turn 5 or 6, but you've also got to account for the times where you look at your board and you're like, well, Galta still costs 8, and I'm not casting it anytime soon, and I can't really attack if I ever want to cast Galta, so you're in a really awkward spot. Obviously, it's got this high ceiling, but it's got a pretty bad floor, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Giant Growth, which for 1 green is a common instant. Target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. This was Magic's original good combat trick. It gives a massive boost for the cost, allowing almost any creature to win combat for a single mana, while still having some upside against removal that is damage-based, and being good at doing lethal out of nowhere. If you're in an aggressive green deck, you're going to want 1 or 2 of these. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Gnarlid Colony, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 beast at common with kicker for 2 generic and a green. If it was kicked, it enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has trample. This wasn't very good in Zendikar Rising. I mean, it's not terrible, but it definitely underperformed in that format. After all, it's inefficient whether you cast it on 2 or 5, and while the flexibility of being able to cast it either way is better than either of those cards individually, you're never going to feel like you're doing something special. Sometimes the trample thing will matter for your other creatures, and this format does have support for counters, so it's probably a C. Next up, it's Grow from the Ashes, which for 2 generic and a green is a common sorcery with kicker for 2 generic. Search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. If this spell was kicked, instead search your library for 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. Cards that just ramp and don't add to the board in any other way tend to underwhelm in most limited formats. This does get the lands for you, and they enter untapped, so sometimes you'll be able to do something with the mana you get. And this was pretty solid in Dominaria, but that was an incredibly slow limited format, and it's highly unlikely this is a similarly slow one. I'm starting it at a D. Next up, it's Inspiring Call, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. Draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. This was not great in Khans of Tarkir, and it had a dedicated +1/+1 counter deck. The reason for that is, even in a deck with lots of counters, there are plenty of times where this is dead or effectively dead, and the ceiling can be high where you give your whole board indestructibility and draw 5 cards, but that's not going to happen very often. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Lana War Elves, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 elf druid at common that can tap for green. 1 mana 1/1 that can tap for green is great, and this is, the original. If you get it on turn 1, your chances of winning the game go up a ton, since you're ramping your mana really early in the game, playing out more powerful spells ahead of your opponent. That said, it is a huge drop-off when you get it in the late game, when it's relegated to being like a chump blocker. But still, the early game upside is so good that you have to value this card pretty highly. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Mild-Mannered Librarian, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 human at uncommon. You can pay 3 generic and a green, and it becomes a werewolf. You put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and you draw a card. Activate only once. This looks nice. You can run it out on turn 1 when you need to, and then later it gets a much more relevant body and even gives you a card back. It's kind of a 5 mana 3/3 that draws you a card when it enters, which isn't great, but you pay in installments, and this is still a 1-drop that is ultimately a 2-for-1. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Nessian Hornbeetle, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 insect at uncommon. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control another creature with power 4 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. This was pretty good last time we saw it. It has a kind of passable 2 mana 2/2 starting point, and it often gets a counter the turn it comes down. It grows really quickly. The fact it does it during combat is a big deal too. Most green decks will be able to get this going. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Overrun, which for 2 generic and 3 green is an uncommon sorcery. Creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. It's been a while since we saw straight up Overrun in a limited format. In the olden days of limited Magic, Overrun was an insanely strong card because it can make almost any board lethal. While I don't think it's quite as good as it used to be, since games don't often end up in board stalls as often as they did in those days, partly because formats tend to be more aggressive, but it is still true that Overrun can turn a lot of boards lethal. The triple green cost and the fact that you need a board for it to do its thing holds it back some, And unlike Preposterous Proportions, you have to hold back when you cast this sometimes. Like if you can't kill your opponent with it, you can't just attack with everything because it has Vigilance like Preposterous Proportions does. And that is a significant difference. This does create lethal somewhat more easily because of Trample, although obviously the stats boost is significantly less. I think a lot of green decks are going to run the first copy of this and take it relatively highly, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Reclamation Sage, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/1 Elf Shaman at uncommon, and when it enters, you destroy target artifact or enchantment. So in some formats, this card's nuts because you always have a target. This is not one of those formats. There just aren't enough targets for this to be in your main deck. It's just an inefficient creature that does something with its enters trigger like a quarter of the time, and that's just not enough. It's probably a D+ in your main deck and a C+ out of your sideboard. Next, it's Scavenging Ooze, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 at rare. It's an ooze. You can pay a green and exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature and you gain 1 life. This is a nice card. It has passable base stats and it gets better and better the longer the game goes, while also gaining you life and hating on graveyards. It's good on 2 and good if you get it late too, since the graveyards will be stocked and you'll have lots of mana, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Snakeskin Veil, which for 1 green is an uncommon instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains hexproof until end of turn. This is great, as it always is, because it blanks removal and helps a creature win combat, and the counter has some extra synergy in this format. Green aggro decks will love playing this. They did make it uncommon, so we're not going to see it as much, which I don't hate, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Vivian Reed, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 5 loyalty legendary planeswalker Vivian at Mythic Rare. She's got a +1 that says look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature or land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. She's got a -3 that destroys target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. And she's got a -8 that says you get an emblem with creatures you control get +2/+2 and have vigilance, trample, and indestructible. She's not amazing, mostly because she doesn't come with a way to consistently add or subtract from the board. The +1 is definitely going to draw a card most of the time, and when the -3 has a target, it's pretty good. But if you don't already have a decent board state, she's not going to be around for very long, so you can't really count on getting to that ultimate. I'm giving her a B-. Next up, it's Wary Thespian, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/1 cat druid at common. When it enters or dies, surveil 1. We've seen 2 mana 3/1s that surveil when they enter or die, like several times lately, including this one, and they play reasonably well. It's not going to be as good as the one in Duskmourn was, because green isn't super into the graveyard in this format, but it does still give you card selection along with a decent stat line, making it fine as a 2-drop. I'm giving it a C. And our last card is Wildwood Scourge, which for X and a green is a 0/0 Hydra at uncommon. It enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, and whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on another non-Hydra creature you control, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. This never really feels efficient, since you pretty much always end up overpaying. Like, a 6 mana 5/5 isn't exactly what you want to be doing, but it can grow and often will, but feeling as clunky as it does earlier in the game keeps it from being anything special. I think it's a C. So those are all the green cards in Foundations. Now we've looked at all the cards in the main set, but there's a bunch more videos coming, including a video about the special guests, a video about the archetypes, a video about the biggest bombs in the format, and draft videos soon enough as well. If you want to make sure you catch that content, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. And if you want to catch up on the rest of the set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.